To get started, before we start talking about actual voting technologies, I want to step back a little bit and teach you about the way security people think. In particular, I want to talk about the security mindset. And this is a way of looking at the world in terms of attacks and defenses, and in particular of looking for ways that things could go wrong. This is a big part of the reasoning and thought processes that make certain people very good at thinking about security problems. So it's going to be important to all of us as we get into looking at voting systems. To sort of give an example of this mindset, I want to tell you a story from Bruce Schneier, who's a well-known security writer and researcher. And Bruce tells a story about how when he was a kid, he was given an ant farm as a gift. And this ant farm came with just the empty ant farm and a card that you would write your address on and send through the mail. And then the company would send you back a plastic tube that had the ants. Now, most people might look at this and say, wow, it's really neat that you can send ants through the mail. But little Bruce Schneier had a different way of looking at the world. He saw this as being really neat because it was a mechanism to have a tube of live ants sent to anyone you wanted. You just had to write their address. So the security mindset thinks about what could you actively make go wrong in a particular system and seeks out ways to make a system fail. In this way, it's different from the typical engineering mindset. If you were, say, building a bridge, erecting a building, engineers typically go about that by thinking about the natural forces that that kind of structure is going to have to withstand, the extremes of climate or wind or earthquakes. And we can reason about those by going back through historical records and figuring out what the maximum likelihood is going to be of particular conditions. And then we know the properties of materials. We can just put enough steel or concrete up to withstand them. But when you're thinking about security, you have to go beyond just this kind of natural failure. You have to think about failures that are induced by other people, people who actively want to make things go wrong. And this is the notion of the adversary. The adversary being an intelligent force, an intelligent party that wants to make your system misbehave, that wants to make it fail, wants to make it behave in a way you don't want it to. And thinking about security in terms of an adversarial problem is at the core of the mindset. In fact, we can even define computer security as the study of how computer systems behave in the presence of an adversary who's trying to make them go wrong. So throughout the course, I'm going to be talking about the adversary interchangeably, might call him the attacker or the bad guy or the criminal. In any case, the important thing is that this is a human intelligence trying to make the system fail. You can think about it as the difference between, say, a building that falls down because it's been overloaded or because of an earthquake, and a building that falls down because of an act of war or a terrorist attack. The latter cases are adversarial failures, and they require a different form of reasoning than normal engineering. So as Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, if you know your enemy and you know yourself, then you can win 100 battles. Knowing your enemy is a critical part of the security mindset. And for this reason, one of the things that security people do all the time is they try to figure out how to think like an attacker. Now, thinking like an attacker involves a couple of things. First, you need to understand techniques for circumventing security, as well as techniques for defending against them. So it's not enough to just study defenses. We also have to study attacks in great depth. The other part of thinking like an attacker is looking for ways that security can break, not just convincing yourself that it won't. We often don't like to think about what could go wrong, but what could go wrong is the central question for computer security. So a little bit more about thinking like an attacker. One suggestion is to try to find the weakest link in a system, the easiest way to attack it. Reason about if you wanted to defeat something, what would be the simplest thing you can do? Because real attackers are also resource constrained, they're lazy. They'll also likely pursue the weakest links first. Those are going to be the first places we need to defend. Another way to think like an attacker is to identify assumptions that the people who designed the security of the system held, but that turn out not to be true. Say the system involves checking people's driver's licenses to make sure they are who they claim to be. This assumes that driver's licenses are difficult to counterfeit or that counterfeits are easy to detect. Those assumptions might be false. A third thing that's a suggestion I like to give people is to try to think outside the box. The attacker's not going to be constrained by the system designer's worldview. The attacker, we should assume, is going to be more clever, more lucky, and more resourceful. Putting all of these things together gives us a worldview that we can adopt if we train for it. And so one thing I'd like you all to try to do in the course is to practice thinking like an attacker at every chance you get. So for every system you interact with, think about what it means for it to be secure and imagine how an attacker could exploit it to violate those security conditions. By system, I don't just mean computer systems or voting systems. If you walk into a store, the store is in some sense a security system. They're trying to guard against, say, shoplifting. So walk into a store, think about how someone could get away with stealing things from it. Now, this is usually taboo, thinking about what could go wrong. Certainly, I'm not encouraging anyone to shoplift. Don't do that. But thinking about it, practicing that discipline of imagining what could go wrong and how you could, or an attacker could, circumvent the security policies that are implicit. This is something that will make you much, much better at reasoning about security systems. So let's go through an example. I'm going to give you a scenario, and we're going to practice thinking like an attacker. So suppose in your college math course, Professor Rote is giving the final exam, and he, in advance, announces what the question's going to be. He'd like you to, without any notes or books, write down the first 100 digits of pi on a piece of paper and turn it in during the exam. So let's ask our security question. What could go wrong? In other words, how could you cheat, violate the implicit security policy of this test, and get away with answering this question without memorizing the answer? So we're going to pause the video and give you a chance to write down a response. And after that, I'm going to come back and discuss some of the possibilities. So welcome back. So thinking like an attacker, what could go wrong with Professor Rote's exam? How could you cheat? You may have thought about ways of smuggling in an answer. Perhaps you wrote it down on a scrap of paper and concealed it. Maybe a more clever way would be to write it on the inside of your hand, or even maybe write it down on a graham cracker. That way it looks perfectly natural, and you could get away with just eating it if you thought you were going to be caught. A somewhat more clever way to cheat in this scenario might be to just print out the question that was distributed in advance and write down the answer at home, then smuggle that into the room and turn it in place of the actual exam. Another thing you could do is you could collaborate with other people in the room, each memorizing a part of the answer, and somehow communicate during the exam, perhaps just trading answer sheets and each writing down your part. Finally, you could, if you have access to the room in advance, maybe you can encode the answer in some way that's not obvious and just have it there visible in the room. You might think about having different colors in the background of a poster hanging on the wall that actually form the digits 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, etc. So the point of this exercise is that there are a lot of clever things that people could do. And actually securing a system like this exam requires thinking about what those different things are so that we can know what we ought to be defending against. Of course, you shouldn't cheat. You're only cheating yourself. But thinking about how people could cheat is the best way to defend against it. So I want to finish this lesson by talking a bit about how we can think as a defender. All of us probably are defenders more often than attackers, and defending systems also requires a cultivated view of the world. In addition to maintaining or thinking like an attacker, we need to think about several other aspects of the system. First, we're building a system. What security requirements do we have? What security policy, in other words, are we trying to enforce? So what are the assets we're trying to protect? And what are we trying to ensure or prevent? Once we define this, we can think about a threat model. And a threat model is a description of who might be trying to attack the system. Who are the potential attackers? What are their capabilities? What are their motivations? And we can rarely defend against every conceivable kind of attack. So we have to limit our threat model to the ones that we think are practical, or at least the ones that we think are worth defending against. Probably your security system at your place of work is not designed to prevent someone from breaking in if they drive through the front door with a tank. That's just outside the threat model that system is trying to enforce. But it probably is trying to defend against someone who is going to smash in the front door, the glass in the front door, and come in after hours. Assessing this kind of risk is one of the most crucial things about being a defender. You need to think about what the weaknesses of the system are, how it would be attacked, what would those attacks cost us in terms of the assets we're defending, and how likely they are. The reason why prioritizing risks is so important is because security is rarely free. There are almost always going to be costs to any defensive mechanism we put in place, whether in an election system or a computer system or a home lock. And so assessing the risks and costs allows us to weigh those costs versus benefits in order to decide which kinds of countermeasures and defenses we're going to put in place. Countermeasures, defenses, can be technical, like a security system for your house, but often non-technical defenses are equally or more important. An example of this might be, in a burglary scenario, might be the police, the threat of jail time, the legal system. These are non-technical defenses, but they work very well against human adversaries, which are the ones that we're concerned about in security. So now that we've developed this model, this brief introduction to the security mindset, we're going to move on in the next segment and talk about what we're trying to protect in voting before we move on in the next lecture to see how voting systems that have been proposed over the years actually try to implement these protections.